When I woke up that Tuesday morning, I had no idea it would be the last day I'd ever look at my son Jerome with the same eyes. I had no idea that by evening, everything I thought I knew about family, respect, and unconditional love would crumble like old paper in my hands. But maybe I should have seen it coming. Maybe the signs were there all along, written in invisible ink that only becomes clear when your heart is breaking. My name is Dorothy, and at 73 years old, I thought I had seen everything life could throw at me. I raised Jerome by myself. After his father walked out when Jerome was just 8 years old, I worked double shifts at the hospital for 20 years, came home exhausted every night, helped him with homework at the kitchen table, drove him to basketball practice in my beat-up Honda, and saved every penny I could for his college education. I sacrificed my own dreams, my own comfort, my own future, because that's what mothers do. That's what love looks like, or so I believed. The house I live in now, the house that would soon become the center of a battle I never saw coming, is a beautiful colonial I bought 15 years ago with my retirement savings. It sits on 2 acres in a neighborhood where property values have skyrocketed. When I purchased it for $250,000, I thought it was an investment in my golden years today. That same house is worth nearly $800,000. It's my sanctuary, my security, my legacy. Or at least, it was supposed to be. Jerome had been dating Candace for 3 years before he proposed, and during those 3 years, I tried my absolute best to welcome her into our family. I really did. When she complained that my cooking was too salty, I adjusted my recipes. When she said my furniture was outdated, I bought new pieces. When she mentioned that the guest room needed renovating for their visits, I spent $10,000 making it perfect. I was bending over backwards, reshaping myself into whatever version of a mother-in-law she could tolerate. Because I wanted Jerome to be happy. I wanted our family to work. But looking back now, I realize that every accommodation I made only fed something hungry and cruel inside Candace. She wasn't trying to fit into our family. She was systematically dismantling it, rebuilding it with herself at the center, and me pushed to the edges. Every boundary I allowed her to cross became the starting point for the next invasion. Every time I said yes when I wanted to say no, I was teaching her that my feelings didn't matter, that my comfort was negotiable, that my dignity was for sale. The wedding planning process should have been my first real warning. When Jerome announced their engagement, I was genuinely thrilled. I offered to help with whatever they needed, thinking this would be a bonding experience for Candace and me. Instead, it became a masterclass in manipulation and control. She wanted the reception at the most expensive venue in town. She wanted a 7-course dinner that cost more per plate than I used to make in a week. She wanted flowers flown in from Ecuador, a dress that cost more than my car, and a honeymoon in Bali that would drain their savings account. Now, I'm not saying young couples shouldn't dream big for their wedding day, but when Jerome came to me, looking stressed and exhausted, explaining that they were already $30,000 over budget before they'd even sent the invitations, my heart broke for him. This was supposed to be the happiest time of his life, and instead, he looked like a man drowning in debt and expectations. That's when Candace first brought up the house. We were sitting in my living room, going over wedding expenses, when she casually mentioned that they'd been looking at the equity in my property. She said it so matter-of-factly, as if my house was already somehow theirs to consider. She explained that if I took out a home equity loan, we could easily cover the wedding costs and still have money left over for their down payment on a starter home. The way she presented it made it sound so reasonable, so logical. After all, she said, the house would eventually be Jerome's inheritance anyway. Why not let them benefit from it now, when they really needed it? She painted this picture of how grateful they'd be, how this would bring our family closer together, how I'd be investing in their future happiness. She even suggested that once they were financially stable, they'd help me with the mortgage payments. I should have said no immediately. I should have explained that the house wasn't just an asset to be leveraged, but my security, my independence, my peace of mind. I should have told her that at my age, taking on new debt was terrifying, that my fixed income couldn't handle additional monthly payments, that the house represented 30 years of careful saving and planning. But I didn't say any of those things. Instead, I found myself nodding along, agreeing to think about it, allowing her to plant seeds of guilt about being selfish with family resources. Jerome didn't say much during this conversation, but I could see the conflict in his eyes. He knew what his mother had sacrificed for him over the years. He knew that asking me to risk my financial security for a wedding was crossing a line. But he also knew that disagreeing with Candace in front of me would create drama he wasn't ready to handle. So he sat there silently, letting his fiancée pressure his mother into making a decision that would fundamentally change my life. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with calculations and fears. The monthly payment on a home equity loan would eat up nearly half my pension. If anything happened to my health, if I needed expensive medical care, if the housing market crashed, I could lose everything. But then, I'd think about Jerome's stressed face, about how much this wedding meant to Candace, about how saying no might damage my relationship with my future daughter-in-law permanently. The next morning, against every instinct screaming in my head, I drove to the bank and applied for the loan. $50,000 against my house, money that would pay for flowers and food, and a party that would last one night but leave me paying for years. The loan officer looked concerned when I explained what the money was for. He asked me several times if I was sure, if anyone was pressuring me. If I understood the risks, I assured him I knew what I was doing, even though every cell in my body was telling me I was making the biggest mistake of my life. When I told Jerome and Candace the news, their reactions couldn't have been more different. Jerome looked relieved, but guilty, like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders, but he knew the cost. He hugged me and whispered, "Thank you," and I could hear the genuine gratitude mixed with shame in his voice. Candace, on the other hand, acted like I'd simply done what was expected. She didn't hug me or thank me profusely. Instead, she immediately started talking about upgrading the flowers and adding more guests to the list now that we had extra money to work with. That's when I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. This wasn't about gratitude or family or bringing us closer together. This was about power and control and establishing a precedent I had just taught Candace, that if she pushed hard enough, if she framed her demands the right way, she could get anything she wanted from me. I had just shown her that my boundaries were negotiable and my financial security was expendable. The months leading up to the wedding were filled with increasingly bold requests and demands. Candace wanted me to pay for the bridesmaids' dresses because her friends couldn't afford them. She insisted I cover the cost of the bachelor party because Jerome's friends were struggling financially. She suggested I might want to contribute to their honeymoon fund, since I'd already invested so much in their future. Each request was presented as reasonable, temporary, something family does for each other. But the most disturbing change wasn't in what Candace asked for, but in how Jerome responded to it all. My son, the boy I'd raised to be respectful and considerate, was becoming someone I barely recognized. He started treating my house like it was already his property, making decisions about renovations and changes without consulting me. He began speaking to me with an impatience I'd never heard before, as if my questions and concerns were obstacles to be overcome rather than the valid feelings of someone he claimed to love. 3 days before the wedding, Candace made a comment that should have sent me running for the hills. We were in my kitchen, finalizing the last-minute details, when she looked around and said, "You know, Dorothy, after Jerome and I get married, you really should think about downsizing. This house is way too big for just one person, and the maintenance costs must be eating up your pension. We've been looking at some nice senior communities that would be perfect for you." The casual way she said it, as if my living situation was her decision to make, left me speechless. She continued, explaining how selling the house would give me a nice nest egg for my retirement years, how the senior communities had activities and social opportunities that would be good for my health, how Jerome and I both worried about me living alone in such a big house. She painted this picture of concerned family members looking out for my best interests. But I heard something else entirely. I heard someone already planning my displacement, someone who saw my independence as an inconvenience to be managed. That night, I sat in my garden looking at the roses I'd planted 5 years ago, thinking about how naive I'd been. I'd spent so much energy trying to make Candace like me that I'd completely missed the fact that she didn't see me as a person to be liked or respected. To her, I was an obstacle between Jerome and the life she wanted, a problem to be solved, a resource to be managed. The wedding wasn't going to be a celebration of love and family coming together. It was going to be her public declaration of victory, her official coronation as the new head of our family. But I told myself I was being paranoid, that wedding stress was making everyone act strangely, that things would settle down after the ceremony. I convinced myself that once Candace felt secure in her marriage, she'd have no reason to keep pushing boundaries. I told myself that Jerome would remember who his mother was and start standing up for me. Again, I clung to the hope that this was all temporary, that love would win in the end, that family bonds were stronger than greed and manipulation. How wrong I was about to discover I had been. The morning of Jerome's wedding dawned crisp and clear, the kind of perfect September day that photographers dream about and mothers pray for. I woke up at 5:30, not because I had to, but because my mind wouldn't let me sleep any longer. Today my only son would marry the woman who had slowly, but systematically been reshaping our family dynamics for the past 3 years. And despite all my misgivings, I was determined to be the gracious, supportive mother Jerome deserved. I spent extra time getting ready that morning, choosing a navy blue dress that Candace had reluctantly approved after rejecting my first 3 choices. She'd said the original dress I picked was too formal, then that the second one was too casual, then that the third one was the wrong shade of blue that would clash with the wedding colors. By the time she approved this 4th option, I'd spent over $600 on dresses for a single day. But I told myself it was worth it to avoid any drama on Jerome's special day. Standing in front of my bedroom mirror, adjusting the pearl necklace that had belonged to my mother, I practiced the smile I would wear all day. The smile that would hide my concerns about the debt I'd taken on for this wedding. The smile that would mask my growing unease about Candace's increasingly bold suggestions about my future living arrangements, the smile that would convince everyone, including myself, that I was nothing but thrilled to be gaining a daughter-in-law. The ceremony itself was beautiful, I have to admit. Candace looked stunning in her $4,000 gown. Jerome looked handsome and nervous in his rented tuxedo, and the church was filled with flowers that cost more than most people's monthly salary. As I watched my son exchange vows with the woman he loved, I felt that familiar tug in my chest that all mothers feel when they realize their child is truly grown, truly moving into a life where they are no longer the most important woman in the room. During the ceremony, I caught glimpses of Candace's family scattered throughout the church. Her parents, who owned a successful accounting firm, sat in the front row, wearing expressions of polite satisfaction. Her two sisters, both married to wealthy men, whispered among themselves while their children fidgeted in expensive outfits. Her extended family filled several pews, all of them dressed in designer clothes that cost more than I made in a month at the hospital. The contrast between our families was stark and deliberately highlighted by the seating arrangements Candace had insisted upon. My side of the church looked sparse. In comparison, my sister Rose had flown in from Atlanta with her husband. My neighbor Eleanor, who had been like a second mother to Jerome growing up, sat with her daughter's family. A handful of my former co-workers from the hospital filled out the rest of my section. Decent, hard-working people who had saved up to buy appropriate wedding attire and given generous gifts despite their modest means. But it was during the receiving line, after the ceremony, that I first noticed the looks. Candace's family members would smile warmly when introduced to Jerome, congratulating him on his beautiful bride and successful career as an insurance adjuster. But when they turned to me, the smiles became more strained, more forced. They would shake my hand with the kind of careful politeness people reserve for service workers or distant relatives they're obligated to acknowledge, but don't particularly want to engage with. I overheard one of Candace's aunts whispering to another family member about how surprised she was that Jerome had turned out so well, considering his background. Another relative commented on how fortunate it was that Candace would be able to help elevate Jerome's social standing now that they were married. The implications were clear. Even though they thought they were being subtle, I was the poor relation, the charity case, the mother-in-law who would need to be managed and contained now that she was officially part of their social circle. The reception venue was even more impressive than the church. Candace had chosen a historic mansion on the outskirts of town, complete with manicured gardens, crystal chandeliers, and a staff of servers who moved through the crowd with military precision. The centerpieces alone probably cost more than I used to make in a week, and the open bar featured top-shelf liquor that I'd never even heard of before. I found my assigned table and was surprised to discover that I wasn't seated with Jerome's family or close friends. Instead, I was placed at a table in the back corner with some of Candace's distant relatives and a few plus-ones who didn't seem to know anyone else at the wedding. It was the kind of table placement that sends a clear message about your importance in the bride's hierarchy. And sitting there, watching Jerome and Candace make their rounds, greeting more prominent guests first, I felt the first sharp pang of what this day really represented. This wasn't just a celebration of their love. It was Candace's public demonstration of her new social position, her official elevation to the status of Mrs. Jerome Washington, and part of establishing that new identity apparently involved subtly diminishing my role in Jerome's life. relegating me to the background where I wouldn't interfere with the image she was trying to project. The dinner service was flawless, the kind of 7-course meal that takes 3 hours to properly appreciate. Between the soup course and the salad, I excused myself to use the restroom, partly because I needed a break from making small talk with strangers, and partly because I wanted a few minutes to collect myself. The day was becoming overwhelming in ways I hadn't anticipated. Walking through the mansion's elegant hallways, I passed several small groups of Candace's family members engaged in animated conversations. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but it's hard not to overhear when people are speaking louder than they realize. After a few glasses of champagne, one conversation in particular stopped me in my tracks. Candace's mother was talking to what appeared to be her sister-in-law about the future plans for the newlyweds. She mentioned how relieved she was that Jerome had finally agreed to help Candace manage Dorothy's financial situation, how it was really for the best that someone younger and more financially savvy take over making decisions about property and investments. She talked about how elderly people often make poor choices about money, how family members sometimes have to step in to protect their assets from being wasted or mismanaged. The casual way she discussed my financial future, as if it was already a settled matter that had been decided without my input, made my blood run cold. These people I barely knew were apparently already planning my retirement, my living situation, my independence, all while eating food I had helped pay for at a wedding I had financially supported. I stood there in that hallway for several long minutes, trying to process what I'd just heard. This wasn't paranoia or wedding day stress, making me imagine slights that weren't there. This was a coordinated campaign to restructure my life in ways that would benefit Jerome and Candace, while systematically stripping away my autonomy and dignity. When I returned to my table, the main course was being served, and everyone was focused on the perfectly prepared filet mignon and roasted vegetables. I tried to engage in conversation with my table mates, but my mind kept drifting back to that overheard conversation. I found myself studying Jerome from across the room, looking for signs of the son I had raised, the boy who used to defend me when neighborhood kids made jokes about our old car or our small apartment. But the man I saw, laughing with Candace's family, accepting their congratulations, and fitting seamlessly into their world, looked like a stranger wearing my son's face. He moved through that crowd with an ease I'd never seen before, as if he'd finally found where he belonged. And that place apparently didn't have much room for the woman who had sacrificed everything to get him there. The speeches began after dinner, and I listened as Candace's father talked about gaining a son, as her maid of honor shared stories about their friendship, as Jerome's best friend from college recounted adventures I'd never heard about. When it came time for the mother of the groom to speak, I realized with growing horror that no one had asked me to prepare remarks. There was no place in the program for my voice, no acknowledgement of my role in Jerome's life, no recognition of the sacrifices that had made this day possible. Instead, Jerome stood up and offered a toast to both sets of parents, thanking them for their love and support. But even in that moment, the focus seemed to be primarily on Candace's family, on their guidance and wisdom, and the example they had set. My contribution was acknowledged with a brief nod and a generic statement about being grateful for everything I'd done. As the evening progressed and the dancing began, I watched from my corner table as Jerome and Candace moved effortlessly through their new social circle. They looked genuinely happy, genuinely in love, and part of me was glad for that. Despite everything else, I wanted my son to be happy. I wanted him to have the kind of life I'd never been able to give him growing up. But another part of me, a part I was trying desperately to ignore, was beginning to understand that my happiness, my security, my dignity were all acceptable sacrifices in service of Jerome's new life. The home equity loan was just the beginning. The casual discussions about my future living arrangements were just the opening moves in a longer game I was only beginning to understand. As the night wore on and the champagne flowed more freely, the conversations around me became more revealing. Candace's relatives spoke openly about property values in my neighborhood, about the tax advantages of certain investment strategies, about how elderly people often needed help managing complex financial decisions. They weren't talking to me, but they were definitely talking about me, and their assumptions about my future were becoming clearer with every passing hour. It was around 10 o'clock when I noticed Candace's youngest sister, Patricia, approaching my table with that particular kind of smile wealthy people use when they're about to deliver what they consider helpful advice. She was maybe 35, married to a hedge fund manager, and had the kind of confidence that comes from never having to worry about money a day in her life. "Dorothy," she said, settling into the empty chair beside me without being invited, "I hope you don't mind me saying this, but I've been thinking about your situation all evening." She leaned in closer, lowering her voice as if she were about to share state secrets. "Candace mentioned that you're still living in that big house, all by yourself. And honestly, I think you're being incredibly brave." I forced my practiced smile to stay in place. "Thank you, Patricia. I appreciate your concern." "Oh, it's not concern exactly," she continued, sipping her champagne. "It's more like admiration. I mean, at your age. Maintaining a property that size must be exhausting. The yard work alone would kill me." She laughed, as if she'd made a clever joke, apparently forgetting that she employed a full landscaping crew to maintain her own grounds. "I manage just fine," I replied. But Patricia wasn't really listening. "That's what's so admirable about your generation," she pressed on. "You're all so stubborn about your independence. My grandmother was exactly the same way. She insisted on staying in her old house until she was practically 90, even though the upkeep was draining her savings account dry. We finally convinced her to move to this lovely assisted living community. And honestly, it was the best decision we ever made for her." The way she said "we" made it clear that my grandmother hadn't been consulted much in this decision-making process. Patricia continued painting her picture of elderly people as burdens to be managed, rather than individuals with their own preferences and rights. "The thing is," Patricia said, glancing around to make sure no one was listening, "property like yours in that neighborhood is just too valuable to let sit there underutilized. I mean, you could sell that house tomorrow and live comfortably in a nice little apartment somewhere for the rest of your life. Plus, Jerome and Candace could really use the help with their down payment. It would be like killing two birds with one stone." There it was. The real reason for this conversation wasn't concern for my well-being or admiration for my independence. It was another attempt to soften me up for the inevitable pressure campaign that was clearly already underway behind the scenes. Patricia was testing the waters, seeing how receptive I might be to suggestions about liquidating my assets for the benefit of the younger generation. "I appreciate your thoughts," I said carefully, "but I'm quite happy where I am. The house has been my home for 15 years, and I have no plans to leave it." Patricia's smile became a little more strained. Of course. I completely understand the emotional attachment, but sometimes we have to think practically about these things. I mean, what happens if you get sick? What if you fall and there's no one around to help? What if the house needs major repairs that you can't afford? Each question was designed to highlight my vulnerability, to make me feel foolish for wanting to maintain my independence. But I'd worked in a hospital for 20 years. I'd seen how families could twist genuine concern into justification for controlling elderly relatives. I knew the difference between someone who wanted to help and someone who wanted to manage. Those are all valid concerns, I acknowledged, but they're my concerns to address as I see fit. Patricia's facade finally cracked slightly. Well, yes, of course. I just think it would be wise to have these conversations with Jerome before you're forced to make decisions under pressure. Family should be involved in these kinds of major life choices. Before I could respond, the music shifted to something slower, and couples began moving onto the dance floor. Jerome appeared at our table, looking handsome and slightly flushed from champagne and celebration. "Mom," he said, extending his hand, "would you like to dance?" I was grateful for the interruption and the chance to escape Patricia's financial planning session. As Jerome led me onto the dance floor, I tried to focus on the moment, on the fact that I was dancing with my son at his wedding, on the music and the laughter and the joy that should have been filling my heart. But as we swayed to the music, Jerome's conversation took an unsettling turn. "Mom, I've been meaning to talk to you about something important," he said, his voice taking on that serious tone I'd been hearing more often lately. "Candace and I have been discussing your situation, and we think it might be time to start planning for your future." Even here, even during our dance, the campaign continued. "My situation?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. "You know what I mean. The house, your finances, your healthcare plans. You're not getting any younger, and we want to make sure you're protected." He spoke as if my age was a disease I was suffering from, rather than a natural part of life. "Jerome, I'm 73, not 93. I'm in good health. I manage my finances just fine. And I don't need protection from my own life choices." His grip on my hand tightened slightly. "Mom, I know you think you're doing fine, but there are things you might not be considering. Property taxes in your neighborhood are going to keep going up. Maintenance costs on a house that size are only going to increase. Your pension isn't going to stretch as far as you think it will." The irony wasn't lost on me that my son was lecturing me about financial responsibility while dancing at a wedding I'd helped pay for with a loan against the very house he was now suggesting I couldn't afford to keep. "Jerome," I said firmly, "we are not having this conversation at your wedding reception." "When then?" he asked, and there was an edge to his voice that I'd never heard before. "Every time Candace or I try to bring up practical matters, you shut down the conversation. We're trying to help you plan for the future, but you act like we're trying to hurt you." The song ended, but Jerome didn't immediately release my hand. Instead, he looked directly into my eyes with an expression that was part frustration, part condescension, and part something else I couldn't quite identify. "Mom, you have to understand that Candace and I are thinking about starting a family soon. We need stability. We need to know that everyone's affairs are in order and that we won't have to deal with crisis management down the road." Crisis management. That's how my son now viewed my independent living situation. Not as a choice I was making, not as a right I was exercising, but as a potential crisis he might have to manage someday. "Your affairs seem to be in order, just fine," I replied. "You have a good job, a beautiful wife, and a bright future ahead of you. Why do my affairs need to factor into your family planning?" Jerome's jaw tightened. "Because you're my mother. Because I love you, and I worry about you. Because I don't want to get a phone call someday telling me that you've fallen down the stairs or had a heart attack and there was no one there to help." His words were wrapped in love and concern, but underneath, I heard something else. I heard a man who had convinced himself that his mother's independence was an inconvenience he shouldn't have to worry about. I heard someone who had been influenced by people who saw elderly family members as problems to be solved rather than individuals to be respected. As Jerome walked me back to my table, I caught sight of Candace across the room. She was watching us intently, and when our eyes met, she smiled and raised her champagne glass in what looked like a toast. But there was something calculating in her expression, something that suggested she knew exactly what conversation Jerome and I had just had. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of cake cutting, bouquet tossing, and farewell conversations. By the time the reception began, winding down around midnight, I was exhausted from maintaining my cheerful facade, while processing the growing realization that this wedding had been more than a celebration. It had been a coming-out party for a new family dynamic, where my role was being systematically redefined without my consent. As guests began gathering their belongings and saying their goodbyes, I found myself standing near the mansion's grand entrance, watching Jerome and Candace work the room one final time. They moved together like a team, thanking guests, accepting final congratulations, and promising to stay in touch. They looked like they belonged in this world of expensive venues and designer clothes and casual conversations about property values and investment strategies. I was reaching for my purse, preparing to make my own quiet exit, when Candace suddenly appeared at my side. She had changed out of her wedding dress into a stylish, going-away outfit that probably cost more than my monthly pension check. "Dorothy," she said, slipping her arm through mine with false intimacy. "I'm so glad we finally have a chance to talk privately. This day has been absolutely perfect, hasn't it?" "It's been a beautiful wedding," I replied diplomatically. "I have to thank you again for everything you've done to make this possible," she continued. "The loan for the wedding expenses, all the little extras you've helped with, your flexibility with all our planning changes. You've been so generous." There was something in her tone that made generosity sound less like a virtue and more like a weakness that could be exploited. "I wanted Jerome to have the wedding he deserved," I said simply. Candace's smile became more predatory. "And that's exactly what makes you such a wonderful mother-in-law. You always put Jerome's happiness first, even when it means sacrificing your own comfort." She paused, letting those words sink in. The implication was clear. She expected this pattern to continue, this dynamic where my comfort and security were expendable in service of their desires. "Now that Jerome and I are officially family," she continued, "I hope we can be completely honest with each other about important matters. No more tiptoeing around difficult subjects or pretending that practical concerns don't exist." My stomach began to clench. Whatever was coming next, I knew it wasn't going to be pleasant. "The thing is, Dorothy, Jerome and I have been doing a lot of research about your neighborhood, your property values, your long-term financial picture. We've even spoken to some financial advisors about the best strategies for protecting assets and ensuring everyone's security as they age." She spoke as if she and Jerome had been conducting a business analysis of my life, as if my personal finances were somehow their concern to research and strategize about. We think it's time to have a serious family meeting about your future, Candace continued. Not because we want to interfere, but because we care about you, and we want to make sure you're making the smartest decisions possible. The royal we was becoming more pronounced in her speech, as if she and Jerome had become a single entity whose collective wisdom superseded my individual judgment. What kind of decisions? I asked, though I suspected I already knew. Candace glanced around to make sure we weren't being overheard, then leaned in closer. Well, for starters, we think you should seriously consider selling the house while the market is still strong. The equity you could access would give you so much more flexibility, so much more security. Plus, Jerome and I could help you find a lovely, smaller place that would be much easier to maintain. There it was. The end game I'd been sensing all evening finally spelled out in clear terms. They wanted my house, not eventually, not someday, when I was too old to care for myself, but now, while they were young and needed the money, and I was still capable of being pressured into compliance. Candace, I said slowly, I appreciate your concern, but I'm not ready to make any major life changes right now. I love my house. I'm comfortable there. I have no intention of selling it. Her smile became more strained, more forced. Dorothy, I understand that change can be scary at your age, but sometimes we have to think beyond our emotional attachments and consider what's really best for everyone involved. Everyone involved, as if my housing situation was a family decision rather than a personal choice. As if my desires and preferences were just one factor to be weighed against the needs and wants of the younger generation. What's best for me, I said firmly, is living in my own home, making my own decisions, and maintaining my independence. Candace's facade finally began to crack. Independence is wonderful, Dorothy, but it can also be selfish. Jerome worries about you constantly. He lies awake at night, wondering if you're safe, if you're making good choices, if you're going to become a burden he can't handle. The word burden hit me like a physical blow. My son, the boy I'd raised alone, the young man I'd put through college, the person I'd sacrificed everything for, apparently now saw me as a potential burden. I've never been a burden to Jerome, I said, my voice beginning to shake with emotion. I've been independent and self-sufficient my entire adult life. Of course you have, Candace replied in that patronizing tone people use with children and elderly relatives. But independence at 73 looks different than independence at 53. Things change, Dorothy. Bodies change. Minds change. Circumstances change. Family has to adapt to those changes. She was painting a picture of inevitable decline, of creeping incompetence, of a future where I would become increasingly unable to manage my own affairs. And she was positioning herself and Jerome as the responsible family members who would reluctantly but necessarily step in to manage my decline. I'm in excellent health, I protested. My mind is perfectly sharp, my finances are in order, and my circumstances are stable. For now, Candace said ominously. But what happens when that changes? What happens when you can't maintain that big house anymore? What happens when you need help with daily tasks? What happens when you can't drive safely? Wouldn't it be better to make these transitions while you still have some control over them? Every question was designed to make me doubt my own capabilities, to make me fear my own future, to make me believe that surrendering control now was somehow a form of empowerment. Before I could respond, Jerome appeared beside us, looking concerned. Is everything okay? You two look pretty serious over here. Candace immediately brightened, slipping seamlessly back into her role as the devoted new daughter-in-law. Oh, we were just having a wonderful conversation about the future. I was telling Dorothy how excited we are to be more involved in family planning now that we're officially married. Jerome's expression relaxed, and he smiled at both of us. That's great. I'm so glad you two are getting closer. Mom, I hope you know how much it means to me that Candace cares about your well-being. Standing there between them, I felt like I was being tag-teamed by professionals. Every concern I raised was met with reasonable-sounding counter-arguments. Every boundary I tried to establish was reframed as stubbornness or fear of change. Every attempt to maintain my autonomy was characterized as selfishness or inability to see the bigger picture. Jerome, I said carefully, I need you to understand something very clearly. I am not ready to make any major changes to my living situation or my financial arrangements. I am happy where I am, and I intend to stay there. Jerome's smile faltered slightly. Mom, we're not asking you to make changes tomorrow. We're just asking you to be open to conversations about the future family. Should be able to discuss these things without anyone getting defensive. Defensive. Now my desire to maintain control over my own life was being characterized as a character flaw, as an overreaction to reasonable family concern. I'm not being defensive, I replied. I'm being clear about my boundaries. Candace laughed, but there was no warmth in it. Boundaries are important, Dorothy, but so is flexibility. So is recognizing when you might need help, even if you don't want to admit it. The conversation was becoming circular, with every point I made being twisted into evidence that I was being unreasonable, stubborn, or unable to see what was best for myself. I realized that this wasn't really a conversation at all. It was an intervention disguised as family concern. I think, I said slowly, that this conversation should continue another time, when we've all had a chance to think more clearly about these important matters. Jerome nodded, but I could see the frustration in his eyes. You're right, Mom. This probably isn't the best time or place, but I hope you'll think about what we've discussed. I hope you'll consider that maybe, just maybe, the people who love you might have some valid concerns about your future. As I drove home from the wedding that night, my mind was reeling with everything that had happened. The beautiful ceremony, the expensive reception, the casual conversations about my financial future, the coordinated pressure campaign disguised as family concern. I felt like I'd been living in a play where everyone else knew their lines except me. But what disturbed me most wasn't the fact that Jerome and Candace wanted my house. It was the sophisticated way they were going about trying to get it. They weren't making crude demands or issuing ultimatums. They were using psychology, social pressure, and emotional manipulation to make me question my own judgment and capabilities. They were making me doubt whether my desire for independence was reasonable or selfish. They were making me wonder whether my assessment of my own health and competence was accurate or delusional. They were systematically undermining my confidence in my own decision-making abilities, while positioning themselves as the rational, caring family members who only wanted what was best for everyone. As I pulled into my driveway and looked up at my beautiful house, the house I'd worked so hard to buy and maintain, I realized that the war for my independence had officially begun, and my own son was leading the charge against me. But I also realized something else. I was Dorothy Washington. I'd raised a child alone while working double shifts. I'd put myself through nursing school at night while managing a household. During the day, I'd survived my husband's abandonment, financial struggles, workplace discrimination, and every other challenge life had thrown at me. I was not going to be defeated by a manipulative daughter-in-law and a son who had forgotten where he came from, not without a fight. The real battle was just beginning. Was just beginning. The morning after Jerome's wedding, I woke up with a headache that felt like someone had taken a sledgehammer to my skull. But it wasn't from the champagne. It was from the crushing realization that my own son and his new wife had spent their wedding reception plotting the systematic dismantling of my independence. I made my coffee with shaking hands, replaying every conversation from the night before. Patricia's casual suggestions about downsizing, Jerome's lecture about financial responsibility during our dance, Candace's thinly veiled threats disguised as family concern. Each memory felt like another weight added to my chest, making it harder to breathe. The house felt different that morning. For 15 years, these walls had represented security, accomplishment, the reward for decades of hard work and sacrifice. Now they felt like a target painted on my back, like something I had to defend rather than simply enjoy. I spent the morning in my garden, trying to find peace among the roses I'd planted and tended with my own hands. But even there, I couldn't escape the echo of Candace's words about property values and market conditions. She'd spoken about my home like it was a commodity to be traded rather than a sanctuary to be cherished. Around noon, my phone rang. It was my sister Rose, calling from Atlanta to thank me for a lovely wedding and to check on how I was feeling after such a big day. "Dorothy, you sounded a little strained last night when we said goodbye. Are you all right, honey?" Rose had always been able to read me better than anyone else, even over the phone, even after just a brief conversation at the reception. She'd picked up on my distress. "I'm fine, Rose. Just tired from all the excitement." And I'm the Queen of England. What's really going on?" I found myself telling her everything. The loan I'd taken against the house, the conversations about my future living arrangements, the coordinated pressure campaign that had intensified throughout the wedding reception. Rose listened without interrupting, making occasional sounds of dismay and disapproval. "Dorothy Washington," she said when I finished, "please tell me you're not seriously considering giving up your house because some gold-digging daughter-in-law thinks she can manipulate you into it." "It's not that simple, Rose. Jerome seems to genuinely believe that keeping the house is a mistake. He thinks he's looking out for my best interests. Jerome is thinking with his pants instead of his brain, and you know it. That woman has got him twisted up so tight he can't see straight. But that doesn't mean you have to go along with their schemes." Rose had always been the fighter in our family, the one who spoke her mind, regardless of the consequences. Growing up, I'd often envied her ability to set boundaries and stick to them. But I'd also seen how that approach sometimes damaged relationships that might have been salvaged with more diplomacy. "What am I supposed to do, Rose? Jerome is my only child. If I don't maintain a relationship with him, I'll lose him completely." "Honey, you're already losing him. The question is whether you're going to lose him while standing up for yourself or while lying down like a doormat." Her words stung because they contained more truth than I wanted to acknowledge. The son who had danced with me last night, while lecturing me about my financial irresponsibility, was already lost to me in many ways. The question was whether I was going to fight to save what remained of our relationship, or surrender completely to keep the peace. "Dorothy," Rose continued, her voice gentler now, "I've watched you sacrifice your whole life for that boy. You gave up dating when he was young because you didn't want to confuse him. You worked yourself half to death to pay for his college. You took out a loan you can't afford to pay for his wedding. When is enough going to be enough?" I didn't have an answer for her question, but I knew she was right. I had spent 35 years putting Jerome's needs and wants ahead of my own, and now he was using that pattern of sacrifice to justify asking for even more. After I hung up with Rose, I sat in my kitchen, staring at the stack of wedding bills that had accumulated over the past few months. The loan payment schedule from the bank, the receipts for the dress, the shoes, the gift, all the little extras that had added up to thousands of dollars. The financial reality of what I committed to was sobering when laid out in black and white. At my current income level, the monthly loan payment would consume nearly half my pension. That left me with barely enough to cover utilities, groceries, and basic maintenance on the house. Any unexpected expense, any emergency repair, any health issue could push me into real financial crisis. But what made it worse was knowing that Jerome and Candace were completely aware of this math. They knew exactly what kind of strain the loan would put on my finances. They knew I was now vulnerable in ways I hadn't been before. They asked me to leverage my house for their wedding, and they were using that vulnerability to pressure me into making even more dramatic changes to my life. That afternoon, I decided to do something I hadn't done in months. I drove to the mall and treated myself to lunch at the little cafe I used to frequent before every spare dollar started going toward Jerome and Candace's expenses. It felt almost rebellious to spend $15 on a sandwich and soup without first calculating whether that money should be saved for some future emergency they might present me with. While I was eating, I noticed a woman about my age sitting alone at a nearby table. She was impeccably dressed, reading a book, and looked completely comfortable in her own company. Something about her confidence made me curious, and when she got up to leave, I found myself approaching her. "Excuse me," I said, feeling slightly foolish. "I hope this doesn't sound strange, but you look so content sitting there by yourself. I'm trying to learn how to enjoy my own company more." She smiled warmly and extended her hand. "I'm Margaret Chen, and there's nothing strange about that at all. Learning to enjoy solitude is one of the most valuable skills we can develop as we get older." We ended up talking for nearly an hour. Margaret told me about her own experiences with adult children who had tried to manage her life choices, about the pressure she'd faced to move into senior housing, about the day she'd finally decided that other people's opinions about her independence were less important than her own peace of mind. "The thing I learned," Margaret said, "is that family members who truly love you want you to be happy and secure. They don't try to convince you that your own judgment is flawed or that your desires don't matter. When someone keeps telling you that what you want is wrong or unrealistic, you have to ask yourself whether they're really looking out for your best interests or their own." Her words resonated with something deep in my chest, something that had been trying to surface since the wedding reception, but that I'd been pushing down out of loyalty to Jerome. How do you know when someone is genuinely concerned versus when they're being manipulative? I asked. Margaret considered the question carefully. Genuine concern respects your autonomy. It offers support without demanding control. It asks what you need rather than telling you what you should do. Manipulation, on the other hand, tries to make you doubt yourself. It presents itself as wisdom while treating you like you're incompetent. It uses your love for family as leverage to get you to do things that benefit others at your expense. As I drove home from the mall that afternoon, I found myself thinking about Margaret's words and how they applied to my situation. Jerome and Candace weren't asking what I needed or wanted. They were telling me what I should do. and characterizing any resistance as stubbornness or inability to see reason. They weren't offering to support my choices. They were trying to change my choices to align with their preferences and financial goals. They weren't respecting my autonomy. They were systematically undermining my confidence in my own decision-making abilities. That evening, as I sat in my living room, surrounded by the furniture and memories I'd accumulated over 15 years in this house, I made a decision. I was going to stop being defensive about my desire to maintain my independence. I was going to stop apologizing for wanting to live in my own home. I was going to stop treating my financial security as something that was negotiable for the sake of family harmony. But I also knew that Jerome and Candace weren't going to simply accept my decision and move on. The conversation at the wedding had been too coordinated, too strategic, too invested in a particular outcome for them to give up easily. They were going to escalate their pressure campaign, and I needed to be prepared for whatever came next. The phone rang around 8 o'clock. It was Jerome, calling to thank me again for everything I'd done to make the wedding possible, and to check on how I was feeling after such a long day. "I'm fine, sweetheart," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. "How was your first day as a married man?" "It's been wonderful, Mom. Candace and I spent the day opening gifts and talking about our future. We're so grateful for all the support you've given us." There was something in his tone that suggested this wasn't just a casual check-in call. He was leading up to something, and I braced myself for whatever request or suggestion was coming next. "Mom, I wanted to follow up on our conversation last night about planning for the future. I know it might have seemed like we were pushing too hard, but I hope you understand that it's only because we care about you. I understand that you think you're looking out for my best interests," I replied carefully, "but I need you to understand that I'm perfectly capable of managing my own affairs." Jerome sighed, and I could hear the frustration creeping into his voice. "Mom, no one is saying you're not capable, but being capable doesn't mean you have to handle everything alone. Family is supposed to help each other, supposed to share responsibility for important decisions. Important decisions about my life should ultimately be my decisions to make," I said firmly. "Of course they should, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't consider input from people who love you and want what's best for you." We were falling into the same circular pattern from the night before, where my desire for autonomy was being reframed as unwillingness to accept help or consider other perspectives. "Jerome," I said, "what exactly are you and Candace proposing that I do?" There was a long pause before he answered. "We think you should at least talk to a financial advisor about your options, someone objective who can look at your whole situation and give you professional advice about the best way to protect your assets and plan for the future." It sounded reasonable on the surface, but I suspected that Jerome and Candace had already chosen this financial advisor, already briefed them on their preferred outcome, already set up a situation where I would be presented with expert opinions that supported their agenda. "I'll consider it," I said, knowing that I needed time to think about how to handle this pressure without completely destroying my relationship with my son. "That's all we're asking for, Mom. Just keep an open mind and consider all your options." After I hung up, I realized that Jerome had never once asked me what I wanted or how I felt about my current living situation. He had never inquired about my happiness or my sense of security in my own home. The entire conversation had been focused on what he and Candace thought I should do, presented as objective analysis of what was best for me. That night, I lay in bed in the house I loved, looking up at the ceiling I'd painted myself 3 years earlier, and I made another decision. If Jerome and Candace wanted to treat this like a business negotiation, if they wanted to bring in professionals and expert opinions and strategic pressure, then I was going to start thinking strategically. 2. I wasn't going to be a passive victim of their manipulation. I wasn't going to let them steamroll me with guilt and fake concern. I was going to fight for my independence with the same intelligence and determination I'd used to build the life they were now trying to dismantle. The next morning, I called my own financial advisor, a woman named Patricia Holmes, who had been helping me manage my retirement investments for the past decade. I explained the situation with Jerome and Candace, the pressure I was receiving to sell my house, and my concerns about being manipulated into making decisions that weren't in my best interest. Patricia listened carefully, asked detailed questions about my current financial situation, and then gave me advice that was both reassuring and alarming. Dorothy, based on what you've told me, you're in much better financial shape than many people your age. Yes, the home equity loan creates some additional monthly expenses, but it's not unmanageable given your current income and assets. The pressure you're receiving to sell your house doesn't seem to be based on genuine financial necessity. Then why are they pushing so hard for me to sell? Patricia's answer was blunt and illuminating. Dorothy, from what you've described, it sounds like they see your house as their future inheritance, and they want access to that wealth now while they're young enough to enjoy it. The wedding loan was probably just the first step in a longer plan to gradually gain control over your assets. Her words confirmed what I'd been sensing, but hadn't wanted to fully acknowledge. This wasn't about my well-being or my safety. This was about money, pure and simple. What would you recommend I do? I asked. First, don't make any major financial decisions while you're under pressure. Second, if you're going to meet with any financial advisor they recommend, bring me with you, or insist on getting a second opinion from someone you choose independently. Third, consider consulting with an elder law attorney about protecting your assets from this kind of family pressure. An elder law attorney. The phrase made me feel ancient, but I understood the necessity. If Jerome and Candace were going to escalate their campaign, I needed professional protection. That afternoon, I made an appointment with Robert Martinez, an elder law attorney who had been recommended by Patricia. His office was in a quiet building downtown, and when I explained my situation, his expression grew increasingly concerned. Mrs. Washington, what you're describing is a textbook case of financial elder abuse. The fact that it's coming from family members doesn't make it less serious. In fact, it often makes it more dangerous because victims are less likely to recognize it or seek help. But they haven't actually forced me to do anything, I protested. The wedding loan was my choice. Was it really your choice, or were you pressured into it through guilt and emotional manipulation? Were you given all the information you needed to make a truly informed decision, or were you told what they thought you needed to hear? When he put it that way, I realized that my consent to the loan had been manufactured through careful manipulation rather than freely given based on complete information. The pattern you're describing typically escalates, Robert continued. First, they establish that you're willing to liquidate assets for their benefit. Then they begin questioning your competence to manage those assets independently. Eventually, they may seek legal guardianship or conservatorship, which would give them complete control over your finances. The thought terrified me. Can they actually do that? If they can convince a court that you're no longer capable of managing your own affairs, yes. And unfortunately, the fact that you've already taken on debt for their benefit could be used as evidence of poor financial judgment. I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare, where my own generosity was being used as evidence against me, where my love for my son was being weaponized to justify taking away my freedom. What can I do to protect myself? I asked. Robert outlined several steps, documenting all financial transactions and pressure tactics, establishing my mental competence through medical evaluations, creating legal documents that would prevent unauthorized access to my assets, and building a support network of people who could testify to my independence and sound judgment. The most important thing, he said, is to stop accommodating their demands. Every time you give in to their pressure, you're teaching them that their tactics work and encouraging them to push harder. As I left Robert's office that day, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: hope. For the first time since this nightmare began, I had a plan. I wasn't going to be a victim anymore. The confrontation I'd been dreading came sooner than expected. 3 days after my meeting with Robert Martinez, Jerome and Candace showed up at my house unannounced, accompanied by a man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as David Richardson, a certified financial planner. "Mom," Jerome said, as I reluctantly let them into my living room, "we thought it would be helpful to have David take a look at your financial situation and give you some objective advice about your options." The ambush was carefully orchestrated. They'd brought their expert, chosen their timing, and presented it as a helpful gesture rather than the pressure tactic it actually was. "I appreciate your concern," I said calmly, "but I already have a financial advisor. If I want a second opinion, I'll seek one from someone I choose myself." David Richardson smiled in that practiced way. Financial salespeople perfect for dealing with elderly clients. "Mrs. Washington, I completely understand your preference for independence, but sometimes a fresh perspective can be valuable, especially when we're looking at complex decisions about property and long-term care planning." "I'm not looking at any decisions about property or long-term care," I replied firmly. "I'm perfectly happy with my current situation." Candace leaned forward with that concerned expression she'd perfected. "Dorothy, we're not trying to force you into anything. We just want to make sure you have all the information you need to make the best choices for your future." "The best choice for my future is to continue living in my own home and managing my own affairs." David opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder full of charts and projections. "Mrs. Washington, if I could just show you some numbers that might help illustrate the challenges you could face if property taxes continue to rise and your fixed income doesn't keep pace with inflation." "No, thank you," I said, standing up. "I'm not interested in seeing projections designed to scare me into making decisions I don't want to make." Jerome's patience finally snapped. "Mom, you're being completely unreasonable. We're trying to help you, and you won't even listen to professional advice." Professional advice that you've paid for and that supports the conclusion you've already reached? That's not objective consultation, Jerome. That's manipulation. The mask slipped from Candace's face, revealing the cold calculation underneath. "Dorothy, whether you want to admit it or not, you're going to need help managing your affairs eventually. Wouldn't you rather make these decisions while you still have some control over them?" "I have complete control over them right now, and I intend to keep it that way." David tried one more approach. "Mrs. Washington, I've prepared some preliminary calculations based on the information Jerome and Candace provided. With the current loan payments on your house, you're going to be financially vulnerable within the next 2 years. If we could just discuss some strategies for—" "Get out!" The words came from somewhere deep in my chest, somewhere I'd kept buried for too long. "All of you, get out of my house right now." Jerome looked shocked. "Mom, you don't mean that." "I mean it completely. You came into my home uninvited, brought a stranger to pressure me with scare tactics, and you're treating me like I'm incompetent to manage my own life. I want you to leave." For a moment, nobody moved. Then Candace stood up slowly, her face hard with anger. She was no longer trying to hide. "This isn't over, Dorothy. Jerome is your son, and he has a right to be concerned about your welfare. If you won't listen to reason, then maybe we need to explore other options." The threat was clear. If I wouldn't voluntarily surrender control, they were prepared to take it from me through legal means. "Are you threatening me, Candace?" "I'm stating facts. Elderly people who refuse help from their families sometimes need intervention for their own protection." Jerome looked uncomfortable with his wife's directness, but he didn't contradict her. That silence spoke louder than any words could have. After they left, I called Robert Martinez immediately and told him what had happened. His response was swift and decisive. "Mrs. Washington, we need to move quickly to protect your interests. I'm going to prepare some legal documents that will make it much harder for them to gain control of your assets. And I want you to schedule a comprehensive medical evaluation to establish your mental competence." "How far do you think they'll go?" "Based on what you've told me, I think they'll file for guardianship within the next few weeks. They're going to argue that your refusal to accept their financial advice demonstrates impaired judgment, that your living situation is unsafe for someone your age, and that family intervention is necessary to protect you from making harmful decisions." The irony was breathtaking. They were going to use my resistance to their manipulation as evidence that I needed to be controlled. But I wasn't the same woman who had meekly agreed to take out a loan for their wedding. 6 months ago, I had learned to recognize manipulation for what it was. I had built a support network of professionals who respected my autonomy. I had discovered that standing up for myself didn't make me selfish or difficult. It made me strong. When the guardianship papers were served 2 weeks later, I was ready. When they brought their witnesses to testify about my supposed incompetence, I had my own experts ready to counter their claims. When they painted me as a confused old woman who needed protection from herself, I had documentation of every manipulative tactic they'd used and every boundary they'd violated. The court battle lasted 3 months. It was expensive, emotionally draining, and devastating to any hope of reconciliation with Jerome. But when the judge ruled that I was fully competent to manage my own affairs and that the guardianship petition was without merit, I felt a freedom I hadn't experienced in years. Jerome and Candace had overplayed their hand. Their greed had been exposed in open court. Their manipulation tactics had been laid bare for everyone to see, and their attempt to steal my independence had backfired spectacularly. 6 months after the court ruling, they filed for bankruptcy. The expensive wedding they'd pressured me to finance, the lifestyle they'd been living beyond their means, the legal fees from their failed guardianship attempt, it all caught up with them at once. I heard through mutual friends that they'd lost their apartment, that Candace had to take a job for the first time in years, that Jerome was working 2 jobs to try to pay off their debts. They'd gambled everything on gaining control of my assets. And when that plan failed, they had nothing left to fall back on. Did I feel sorry for them? Sometimes, late at night, I'd think about the little boy Jerome used to be and feel a pang of sadness for how far we'd fallen. But mostly, I felt relief that I'd stood up for myself, relief that I'd protected my independence, relief that I'd learned the difference between love and manipulation before it was too late. I still live in my beautiful house. I've paid off the wedding loan early, with money I saved by not giving in to their other financial demands. I've made new friends, taken up new hobbies, and discovered that my life is richer and more fulfilling when I'm not constantly sacrificing my well-being for people who don't appreciate it. Sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are the ones willing to hurt you the deepest. But sometimes, if you're strong enough and smart enough and stubborn enough, you can protect yourself from that hurt. You can choose your own happiness over their expectations. You can choose your own dignity over their manipulation. My name is Dorothy Washington. I'm 74 years old, and I've learned that the most important person I need to take care of is myself.